Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, we have quite a show. How about this? Is the Pennsylvania lottery rigged? But first, victims and sex offenders. Let's get to it.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host.
Well, what a show. We have the Pennsylvania Auditor General who's going to give us some insights on whether the Pennsylvania lottery is rigged. We got some other big topics that he's going to take up. But first, victims and sex offenders. Joining me to talk about that and more, Marc Levy. He's with the Associated Press, and Angela Couloumbis. She's with the Philadelphia Inquirer. Two journalists we have on regularly to provide insights, give us a little update, give us a little history about the big issues, the big policy decisions, and some politics in the state of Pennsylvania. Angela Couloumbis, let's start with you. I'll tell you, a lot of big news in the last couple of weeks. Sex offenders and victims. You wrote a piece about it. Weigh in.
Yes, so there's two issues that we can talk about today that touch on this. Number one, Governor Wolf signed a package of bills that would eliminate the criminal statute of limitations on child sexual abuse for future victims, and also extend the time that those future victims would have to bring civil suits. But I think there has been some disappointment on the part of some victims that it does not immediately open a window in the statute of limitations that would allow older victims, people who have aged out of the statute of limitations, to temporarily, like a 2-year window, to temporarily file civil suits against their abusers and any institutions that covered it up. This obviously grew out of the grand jury report last year, the scathing grand jury report from the Attorney General's office that talked about pervasive and decades worth of abuse within the most Catholic dioceses in the state.
And there's some victims advocates who aren't happy about this, correct?
Right. So the alternative that was offered by Senate Republicans who successfully blocked the 2-year window in law, the alternative offered was change the Constitution to carve a 2-year window into the Constitution. So that creates a much longer process to get that done, and it has to go before voters in a statewide referendum.
Correct.
And the things that victim advocates are worried about now is, one, they have to trust the legislature to pass this again in 2021. The other thing is that then you would, they're worried that an opponent of this, say an insurance company or a diocese, would run a very high-cost ad campaign against it and help defeat it in front of voters. So those are the things that they're concerned about. They still want the 2-year window in statute, but the Senate Republicans have solidly defeated that.
Yeah, and so ultimately, what's going to happen?
Well, I think it's we have to wait and see if the legislature will make it a priority in its next 2-year session. That isn't, so the earliest it could go on the ballot is in 2021 because this is a constitutional amendment. And that remains to be seen. It really is incumbent on the makeup of the Republican caucus in the Senate. They have been the ones who have historically been a little more reticent in passing this type of reform.
All right, so here we are. We're at the literally now the legislature is just about done for the year with the holiday season upon us. I'll put it that way. And then we have next year's 2020 election. Every individual in the state house is up, half the Senate. Typically in election years, Mark, sit back in your chair because there's not a lot. I mean, is there anything going on? We don't hear much from Governor Wolf with an agenda. He could have one at the beginning of the year. He could lay out an agenda for this year. He was just reelected, so that's not an issue, correct?
Right. He's got time. He could put something else out there. But what we know right now is that the agenda items he has out there have essentially stalled in the legislature. There's one item of note, a minimum wage bill that the Senate passed. And you have to remember that the legislature is controlled by Republicans. They have for a long time opposed an increase in the minimum wage. So a $9.50 bill over I think it's almost 2 years past the Senate. It's in limbo in the House. Leadership in the House, Republican leadership, has been very quiet on it. It doesn't seem that they're sure that it can even get out of committee in the House. So it may go nowhere. Now, the bargain that the governor made is that he would not put new overtime regulations into force.
Yeah, but what's important is that the majority leader in the state Senate, Senator Corman, you know, in a sense, took the lead. Only 7, if you'll correct me if I'm wrong, only 7 individuals out of 50 voted against it. So it was bipartisan, right?
That's right, yep.
It was bipartisan. The House is generally, and we're using conservative and liberal descriptively. We're not using them pejoratively. Right. But the House is more conservative than the Senate. Is that fair?
Yes, it's more conservative. The caucuses are a bit more, they're bigger and they're harder to get people to agree on a single point and a single price point in particular for the increase.
All right, we're going to take a break. We come back. We're going to continue with the important agenda. We're going to find out what's going to happen in our state.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association and Partners for Public Education, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
All right, joining me as often is the case is Marc Levy with the Associated Press and Angela Couloumbis with the Philadelphia Inquirer. We're talking about a variety of what I'll call year-end situations that have emerged in the executive branch as well as in the legislature. And first of all, tell our viewers, what's Megan's Law? Why is it important?
Well, Megan's Law was signed into law nearly 25 years ago here in Pennsylvania. It is essentially known as the Sex Offender Registration Law. It requires a public registry of convicted sex offenders. It's available on the internet. And
they're required to sign up.
They're required to register, and then that registry is made public through the Megan's Law website. And there is, in certain instances, community notification when a sex offender moves into a community. It was named after a 7-year-old New Jersey girl who was killed by her neighbor, and similar laws are in place in all 50 states. What we're seeing right now are all eyes are on the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, because there are 5 cases before it that challenge the constitutionality of the law. Among other things, they say it's harmful to reputation. It is cruel punishment to have people be on this registry. In some cases, it's a lifetime
and their argument is they moved into a community. Everybody knows that a sex offender is. But on the other hand, should people be aware?
Right.
It's a tough issue, isn't it?
It's a very tough issue, and there's a lot at stake depending on how the justices rule.
Yeah. So moving ahead, by the way, Josh Shapiro, the Attorney General, put out a tweet this past week, 60 public officials of all types. We're talking about people at the local level have been prosecuted by his office for a variety of charges, so pretty active Attorney General. So let's talk about the year end and what would you say was the most significant accomplishment of the legislature in recent months?
Well, I mean, the package of bills that the governor just signed into law with respect to child sexual abuse that stemmed out of the Attorney General's grand jury report last year was, I mean, this was years in the making, and one of the farthest reaching things they did was lift the statute of limitations on all criminal prosecutions of child sexual abuse. So in the past, it had been age 50. Now it's gone. There is no statute of limitations on that. And Josh Shapiro, in talking about it, had said that during this whole grand jury investigation, they were only able to pursue 2 of these priests who were accused.
Many of them are deceased, right?
And many were deceased.
The people who were harassed, allegedly harassed, have also died. And, that's tough when you go back 30 and 40 years, isn't it?
It is, but what he said is that had there been no statute of limitations, they could have pursued more than 100.
Right. All right. So as we sort of wrap up this session, Governor Wolf has historically called for a big issue, a severance tax, a tax on the amount of cubic feet extracted from the fracked wells. This is a natural gas, which is a big deal in our state, particularly for the economy. There's no prospect as we move into 2020 that things like severance tax, things like big changes in the income or sales,
No, I don't see it. I mean, one of the things that Governor Wolf did to make it, in theory, more palatable was he tied it to financing major infrastructure projects across the state. And
that's popular, right?
That, in theory, would have been
infrastructure,
popular.
I mean,
absolutely popular. But it did not go over well in the legislature, so I don't see the prospects for that changing anytime soon, particularly in a big election year like 2020.
All right.
The House in particular has drawn a very hard line in the sand at passing any sort of tax on natural gas drilling.
But in election years, the legislature doesn't do taxes. I mean, they're not.
They're a lot less likely to do something
I love the way
controversial.
You put that.
They have. I think they passed a cigarette tax in election year once, but they're going to do something that's relatively uncontroversial.
Well, thanks. We'll have you back. We got a big year coming up. Coming up, we have the Auditor General of the state of Pennsylvania, Eugene DiPasquale. He's coming up. We got a lot to talk about. The one I want to get into is the Pennsylvania lottery rigged. I mean, imagine that. We'll be back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
Well, the state's Auditor General Eugene DiPasquale is sitting across from me. He's the guy who's responsible for making sure that your tax dollars are spent wisely and legally. Does that cover
effectively too? Effectively.
Oh, I'm glad you put that in effectively. All right. When you first put out a promo on this, I couldn't believe it. Is the lottery in the state of Pennsylvania rigged? And I don't know if you're prepared to say it is or it isn't yet, but why are you even looking at the lottery? What caused you to say, let's take a look at whether the lottery is functioning?
This has actually led to some criminal investigations and even some guilty pleas in other states. And so there are some stores in Pennsylvania that sell the tickets and some winners that keep happening. And there's no statistical way to explain it away, so we are going to be doing a full audit to make sure that everything is on the up and up.
Now, wait a minute. The only way that would be possible is if you sell a ticket after. How would you sell a ticket after the drawing? I mean,
and all we know is that this is happening. That's all we know.
That is weird.
And it is weird. And when it first came to me, I was somewhat dismissive of it, but it kept happening. So I felt we had no choice but to dig into this and make sure that Department of Revenue and Lottery are doing everything they can to protect the integrity of the game.
This could take several years.
It is going to be a hard audit. There's no question about it. But to me, all the senior programs that are at stake on this are critical.
Tell the folks about the senior in general, the lottery money goes.
It funds a host of programs, whether prescription drug help for seniors, bus rides for seniors, health care. There's a whole, even some rental assistance. There's a whole host of issues that the lottery actually pays for. It's over $1 billion a year in aid to seniors. So the integrity of the game is critical for the state of Pennsylvania.
All right. Let's move on. Every 5 minutes or so, I'm exaggerating a bit, someone will come up, or I'll have a conversation with someone will come up to me, and when we start talking about prescription drugs, the cost of I know the companies, the research companies need the money to do the research, but we're talking about hundreds of dollars in some cases, and now we have another situation involving prescription drugs in our state. What is it?
The House just passed a bill, basically, in a large part based on my recommendation, what we uncovered in our audit. You basically have these middle people that have now getting $3 billion a year.
Who are the middle people?
They're called pharmacy benefit managers, and they basically are supposed to negotiate with big pharma and the retailers to get you better prices. But we've seen it's just not working. In Pennsylvania tax dollars, in 2012, we spent $1 billion. Now we're giving these companies $3 billion, and we're not getting any benefit at the retail level, and consumer and prescription drug costs continue to go through the roof.
So what's the point? Can they be removed? Can the middle folks be removed from the whole process?
They can be. Ohio is moving that direction. I also believe that, first of all, I'm not even allowed to audit their contracts. So they get state tax dollars. I'm not even allowed to audit their contracts. That's one thing, the legislation that the House passed. And if the Senate passes it, I can at least get into their books and then see what they're doing.
Yeah, wow. All right, we're going to run to a break. When we come back, how about this? Fentanyl, we're talking about drugs, and then we'll talk about climate change. I'm chatting with the Auditor General Eugene DiPasquale. We'll get to some important subjects after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care.
All right, Eugene DiPasquale joins me. He's the Pennsylvania Auditor General. We were talking about prescription drugs. Now let's talk about why should the folks out there care about fentanyl? What's the situation that you think is critical and needs to be brought to everyone's attention?
Pennsylvania taxpayers are actually paying a huge price for this overdose epidemic. First of all, we've got to do a better job of securing our ports of entry where this stuff from China and Mexico is getting in. So that has to get done. But then what happens is when people overdose on it, first of all, there's a human tragedy that goes with that. But Pennsylvania taxpayers end up footing the bill many times. People go to the emergency room. They don't have health insurance. The taxpayers through the Medicaid end up reimbursing the hospital for it, or many of the people that are overdosing are also on some type of public subsidy. So there's a huge cost to taxpayers from this overdose on fentanyl. And the best way to deal with this, A, is try to get people help so they're not addicted to it, and B, doing a better job of securing our ports of entry so this stuff from China doesn't get in.
Well, if I understand this, wasn't this part of the whole opioid attack that I thought was bearing some fruit?
There is bearing some fruit. There's no question about it. But this now is a much more lethal drug that is coming in. So it's almost like we're fixing one problem and then another problem crops up. This stuff is significantly more lethal.
Yeah. You need a prescription for it?
There are many people buying this on the street, and that's the problem.
So in other words, it's bought on the street just like many other of these opioid drugs are. And
a lot of the people that are addicted don't even know what's in it. So it is so dangerous, and they don't know what's in it. And again, I'm not saying people should buy it even if they know what's in it, but it's so dangerous, and people, once they get hooked on this, it just leads to a very dark path.
I don't know. That's like when we have these discussions about vaping. Right. First of all, I've never smoked in my whole life, so I don't know. But now you get the lung diseases. It's like 1 minute after the next minute, or maybe 1 day after the next day, we find another aspect of our culture that just leads people into serious health problems.
And when I say we, maybe not you and me, but a lot of people are putting stuff in their bodies and they don't know what's in it and how the human body reacts to that.
I'm gonna be impolite, but you're a health junkie. Yeah, I know you work out.
Look, I'd probably take it to one extreme, but there's people that put stuff in their bodies and they don't know all the chemicals and how those chemicals react with you can be different person to person.
Is there
and it's very
anything
dangerous.
the legislature is doing or can do about this?
I do know that on the vaping, both at the state and federal level, you can at least bump up the age limits of when people can legally do it.
Yeah, wow. All right, before I let you go, climate change, what's going on with that in your audits?
Huge financial impact to the state. These severe storms have a significant impact on our stormwater, our certainly on air and climate, but on things we can do in Pennsylvania. It impacts our roads. It's overburdening PennDOT when it comes to just mudslides and trying to repair the roads. These severe storms have a huge impact on our stormwater, and that's why the Susquehanna River, for example, is one of the most polluted rivers in the entire country. So there's a huge amount of infrastructure work we can do to actually try to prevent environmental damage and save taxpayer dollars if we make those smart investments now.
My sense about this is we didn't get into it overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. And we have to be careful as we do it that we don't wreck the economy while there has to be a transition. Go ahead.
Anytime somebody tells you there's a simple solution for something that's a very complex problem, beware. It is not a simple solution. It's not one thing, and it will take many years. But we do need to start doing it now.
Yeah. Have you done audits? Are you doing?
We did. What we did was we looked at the financial impact of climate change on Pennsylvania, the impact on our roads, on our bridges, our stormwater, and our water. And we looked at that, and it's in the billions of dollars.
So is the legislature addressing it in any way?
What we recommended was the governor had a proposal on taxing the Marcellus Shale to use it for infrastructure improvements. We believe we believe that is a way that actually Pennsylvania could do its part on climate change by improving the infrastructure.
Yeah. Well, we get into this big debate. Nuclear power, we had the 3 Mile Island closed and another one out in Beaver County, I think, is scheduled to be closed. I could be wrong about that. But the bigger point here is that nuclear power doesn't emit any carbon. And then we have natural gas, which they say is better than petroleum, and natural gas is a huge part of the economy. So we get into that debate about climate change versus huge areas of the economic strength of the state, and it becomes merely difficult to resolve.
Yeah, I think we've got to certainly move towards where we're trying to have zero carbon powers. We're moving forward but it's going to take plenty of time to get there, and we have to have ways to transition there. And I do think we need to try to become more efficient as well. Like how do we become more energy efficient as ourselves?
We're going to see electric cars. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's one of the things that we're going to have to look at.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, I want to thank you for coming in, and these audits are particularly important. You Auditors General, I think I got that.
That's right.
Grammatically correct. All right. We'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, you stay well.